Hi guys, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center. The Nehru Center is the cultural wing of the Indian High Commission in the UK, and we've been in existence for many decades, and we organize wonderful events at this very auditorium. You can register for our newsletter at our website nehrucenter.org.uk. You don't need to write them down, they will be displayed at the bottom of the screen. You can also come to our Facebook page, which is a verified page, the Nehru Center. You can follow updates on all our events on Twitter as well, the Nehru Center, that's also a verified account. Or you can come to our YouTube channel, again, the Nehru Center. We are nothing if not consistent. I hope you do come to our online channels and enjoy the events that we are putting up for you. Thank you so much for all your love and support. Namaste, Jai Hind.
Namaste. Thank you so much for joining us at this program where we are to launch this wonderful book, Acrobat. I will speak a bit on this, of course, but before that, if you could call up our two guests on stage, please. Nandana Sen and Bhanu Kapil. Hi Nandana, hi Bhanu. I hope the both of you are well. Thank you so much for joining us. Nandana is joining us. Namaste. Nandana is joining us from New York, and Bhanu, I believe, is joining us from London. Bhanu, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Cambridge.
Okay. All right. My apologies. Um, Before I get into, I do want to speak a bit about this book before I leave the conversation to Bhanu and Nandana. But before I do that, we are a Sarkari place, as you all know, and so I must do the formalities and lead the formal introduction of Nandana Sen and Bhanu Kapil. Nandana Dev Sen is a writer, actor, and child rights activist. She has written 6 children's books, translated into more than 15 languages globally, and starred in 20 feature films from 4 continents in numerous languages. She has represented UNICEF, RAHI, and the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights to fight against child abuse and to end human trafficking. Winner of the last World Champion Award and multiple Best Actress Awards, Nandana is Child Protection Ambassador for Save the Children India. She is, of course, a very talented artist, but she is also a wonderful human being, as you can clearly see the causes that she supports. Bhanu Kapil is the author of 6 full-length works of poetry prose, most recently How to Wash a Heart, which was the winner of the T.S. Eliot Prize and a Poetry Book Society choice. Last year, Kapil was awarded a Wyndham Campbell Prize and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Chol Mondale Award. Did I pronounce it correctly? I don't know. Both for poetry. She is a fellow of Churchill College. Uh, what a pleasure to have the both of you on stage, and what a pleasure that the Nehru Center has the opportunity to launch this wonderful book. I read it, and I'm Acrobat for those who do not know. Poems by Nabaneeta Dev Sen, of course, the brilliant Bengali poet, and translated by her daughter Nandana Dev Sen. Um, of course, the poetry is beautiful, and this will be discussed in detail by Nandana and Bhanu. Who better to do it than the two of them? But if I can tell you, Nandana, what I got from this book, the wonderful poetry, but also your heartfelt letter to your mother at the end. Nandana was unfortunately she lost her mother recently, and one of the things that struck me is, I mean, grief is essentially unexpressed love, right? It's love that you want to express, and the one you want to express it to is not there anymore. Um, and I guess all of us struggle with that, how to express it. And perhaps one of the best ways to express that grief and that love is a tribute to your mother. Her beautiful poetry, produced in a wonderful book, translated in a truly heartfelt manner by Nandana. And so, if I can just say, Nandana, I have lost people very dear to me recently over the last few years. 3 men who I utterly admired over the last few years. Suddenly they left tragically. Your letter really touched me. Thank you so much for giving Nehru Center the opportunity to launch this book. And I'm sure that our audience will love it. And those of you who haven't picked up this book as yet, shame on you. The book is available in the UK and the US, so do check it out. I think it is available on Amazon. A ticker will be displayed at the bottom. And Bhanu, over to you. I'll not take more time. You should drive this conversation.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful introduction and welcome.
I'm so sorry, Bhanu. I am a little forgetful at times, but I'm a creative guy. I get the license to be forgetful and silly. We were supposed to do a book launch as well. And I was just reminded by my very efficient tech guy, Vineet Jory, that I was supposed to do that before I exited the stage. So, Bhanu, if I may just cut in. Nandana, we have created a launch video for you because we don't get the pleasure of ripping apart wrapping paper in these online events, but we get to do something which can be equally fun. So, if we can play that launch video, please.
Can't wait. That was really beautiful and quite a surprise. It's very creative to be able to actually make the kind of magic of the reveal of a book happen digitally like that. Thank you so much, Amish, for your very, very touching introduction. It's very moving for me to hear you speak about the book and my mother's poetry and the process of grieving. This has been a year in which the whole world has grieved in so many ways, and we continue to grieve. And I also want to thank the wonderful team at the Nehru Center. I know that Archana and Vineet have been working tirelessly to make this happen and to make all of these beautiful, magical surprises pop up on screen. So thank you. I want to thank this big audience that we have today. I understand that no less than 6 time zones are represented. Happy Translation Day to everyone. Many of you know that my mother was beloved and prolific in every genre, but unbelievably, this book, Acrobat, is in fact her very first book to be published for an international audience. So, we, as Amish mentioned, my mother actually passed away just 2 weeks after I wrote this book. So to be able to celebrate its release with all of you, truly globally from all over the world today, is very special. Now, I can't tell you, Bhanu, how grateful I am to you for having for having made the time to celebrate my mother's work, and not just making the time for loving that work in the way that you have. And as you know, I have long been inspired by your work. My bookshelf is full of your books. So by being here with me today to celebrate my mother's poetry, you have made this occasion truly auspicious. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful
Thank you
to
so
see
much.
positive emotions and love all around. So this is good thing for me to exit on. And Bhanu, the stage is all yours. You drive the conversation, and thank you so much. Thank you, the two of you, for giving us this opportunity, giving the Nehru Center this opportunity.
Thank you, Amish.
Okay, thank you. Here we are in the fountain of love.
We are indeed in the fountain of love.
Standing right in it. And I think, Nandana, let's begin, if we can, by bringing your mum into the space, into the fountain with us.
Lovely.
What beauties. I'm going to just read something, Nandana. And as I'm reading it, I'm just going to stay close to this unexpected emotion that has filled the beginning of our hour together. And so this is out of love for you and for your mum. Acrobat, an orbital note. I've been trying to write something I could read aloud as part of this launch, something that might honor Acrobat and also speak to the synchronicities that brought me into its orbit, specifically a late summer event at Newnham College earlier this year, in which an ecstatic and brilliant Bengali poet scholar was mentioned in passing. Who was she, I wondered, and what did it cost her to invert an epic? What did she risk? Bookmarking those questions, not knowing the work at that point, but curious, I continued on with the poetry workshop I was teaching. The next day, Archipelago Press wrote to me, and I realized that this was she, the young researcher as she once was, Nabaneeta Dev Sen. Later that same day, researching the visions of Aurobindo Ghosh in the Alipur jail, I clicked on an interview with Nabaneeta in which she recounted as a child visiting the ashram at Pondicherry and meeting Mira Alfasa, or the mother, Sri Aurobindo's consort. That was enough for me to say yes, hell yes, when Nandana invited me to join her as part of this event, in which the dream is we might hear the stories and memories evoked by particular poems and something about the experience of translating them. What I also want to say is how meaningful a company Acrobat has been this summer into autumn, a companion species text from which I'm learning so much about the link between creativity and freedom. A friend of mine, the Honduran poet Saira Pinto Bonsali, married now to an Indian partner, speaks about the artifacts of oppression that must be removed from the body in the form of poems. For me, Acrobat is a radical, moving example of poems that must be written in order to make space for everything else, a life, a way of being, as yet to arrive. Or perhaps this other life is arriving as we write it. There's an analog to this idea in the way that Nabaneeta writes about the social and sexual liberation made possible by practices rooted in the imagination. Sorrow, as Nabaneeta names it, or exhaustion. In one eye, a teardrop, and in the other, nothing. Yes, how does oppression vibrate in the body as a mood, a feeling, the limit of what can be given or received? It's here, at this limit, that Nabaneeta observes the burnt grass in the yard, or an umbilical cord throbbing, or so it seems, mid-air, floating on the page. It's here that intense desires, the desire for justice, the desire for a beloved who doesn't look away, the desire for a bowl of pickled chilies, enter the work. Write it all, Nabaneeta seems to be saying, evoking the poem as a set of instructions: how to stand aloof, how to caress, how to expel shame from the body, how to make a home in empty space beneath a blood-red moon, how to drink the water that remains in the bowl once the chilies have been consumed. Quench your thirst, but let your lips burn. In Acrobat, Nabaneeta writes herself out of one life and into another. She doesn't sanitize daily life, ongoing life, but most of all, she doesn't pretend that the body is indestructible or permanent material that will outlast time. Don't pretend. Don't look away. Keep going. After all, as Nabaneeta reminds us in a memory brought forward by Nandana's moving preface, how do I know who I am until I have written myself and read myself? There I was, Nabaneeta, taking shape on a piece of paper. And on that note, I will stop and gesture through the steam, wait a second, of a cup of tea, hang on, to Nandana herself, Acrobat's translator, the one who unfolded each piece of paper, then smoothed it out with her palm. Nandana, the invitation is this: to read poems, to tell us stories from the back of your heart, and to answer the question, perhaps, what is a book?
What a breathtaking and profound introduction to my mother's poetry. You know, and you truly revealed the heart of her poetry in just a few lines, stunning lines. There was such deep resonances, Bhanu, between your poetry and my mother's poetry. I think that's one of the many reasons why I've always been drawn to your work, to your voice, and especially the strong connection that you have always articulated between poetry and freedom, between and the way you have explored ways in which poetry can create worlds. In fact, the ways in which poetry needs to create worlds in response to the world we live in response to the oppression and the injustice in the world that we live in. So this is just I'm almost speechless in response to your very beautiful, very, very beautiful, actually a kind of letter about my mother. But I also wanted to thank you for curating the poems that I'm going to read. It means a lot to me that these are the poems that spoke to you. They're my favorite poems as well, but thank you for that. I'm going to start with the title poem, Acrobat, but I'm going to read it to you all in Bengali first so that I can share the cadence of my mother's original poetry with you. Madari. ভেবেছে সে বুঝি খুব সুন্দর মাদারি খেলা জানে, দু হাতে সময়কে নিয়ে লোফালুফি, এখন তখন দুটোই নাচাবে দুমুঠোতে, হেঁটে যাবে দড়ির ওপরে, ভেবেছে সে সব কিছু পারে, জীবনে একবারই শুধু দড়ি কেঁপে ওঠে। Acrobat. She thought she knew acrobatics rather well, that she could juggle time with both hands, play with the now right next to the then. She would make both dance, she thought, fist to fist. And she would glide so smooth along the tight rope. She thought she could do absolutely anything at all. Only once in your life will the rope shiver. Now, this poem I translated actually for this thin book called Make Up Your Mind, which I did as a birthday surprise for my mom when she was turning 75. So I had to do all the translations on the sly. Now, the small challenge in this poem was that in Bengali, the third person pronoun is not gender specific. So she could be translated either as he or she. And to me, this poem was about the multitasking that every woman has to do to survive. So I translated it as a she, But when it was no longer a surprise and she had got the book and she loved it, I asked her that question, whether whether that was the right choice, and whether it was in fact about being a woman. And Ma said, no, it's actually not about being a woman. I wrote the poem about being a poet, about how it's a very delicate balancing act as a poet, how one word too many or one line too long can throw you off the rope. But I love your interpretation of it as well, and she didn't want me to change it. But it was so interesting that the way I read the poem, the reality of the poem to me was quite different from what had inspired her to write it. When it came time to choose the title of the book, she chose Acrobat because she felt that the book represented both. The book was both about the experience of being a woman, and it was about the process of being a poet. And that's how this book came to have this title. I'm going to read to you another poem that my mother loved, which is about the delicate and sometimes confounding work of a poet. It's called Alphabet Bird. When night falls, I search for him. I bring him home. I look him in the eye, and I cage language. When day breaks, once again the world wraps around my eyes, and off he flies, taking each word, that alphabet bird. Now this poem, I knew she loved it, so I really wanted to translate it for this book, The Secret Book. And I translated it very faithfully and quite literally, and looked at it, and I felt that it really wasn't doing her original justice, that even though it was a very truthful translation, that something about the helplessness that a writer can feel was not coming through. The inability of the loss of control over language is what this poem is about. So then I decided that I would take a step back, and rather than translating it literally, I would ask myself this question, which is, how would my mother have written this poem were she to write it in English? And when I thought of it like that, I felt more free to add on a few lines that weren't there. So I added the lines, and I cage language. I added the lines, taking each word. I expanded the rhyming scheme that was already there in the poem. And when the book came out, she really liked the version. She liked the adaptation. I asked her if I should go back to the literal translation, and she said, no, absolutely not. This is the true version. This is the true English version of the poem. And the reason why I say this is that this helped me a lot in translating Acrobat, because I was doing it on my own, which is not what I was expecting to do. The fact that she had endorsed my adaptation, that she had such a strong and positive response to the way I had taken some creative liberties with her work, made it much more, it freed me, it liberated me in a way. It made me feel much more free in terms of how to translate her work. And very often when literal translations did not convey the power of her poetry, I turned to adaptations like this one. I'm going into a poem that actually that is quite connected in a way, Bhanu, to what you say about the link between creativity and survival. This is something that you've actually written about extensively, and there's a poem about it in How to Wash a Heart, which I love, and I would love you to read that later. And, well, let me just read the poem. In poetry: stay alive, show yourself clearly, like an unfailing passport photo. Stay awake in every line, you, like an unquenchable thirst. Yes, you, the pain that tears my heart apart. Show yourself clearly, like a flower in full bloom. Don't hide from me, as long as I live in poetry. So, for my mother, poetry truly was an essential tool for survival, in the same way that you have written about in your work, and not in all of your books. You give voice to that. You delve deep into that question, delve deep into that connection between creativity and survival. What that allows us to do, what that excludes as well, in some ways. But one of the things that I discovered, while I always knew that my mother had a very strong connection with poetry, of course, and she wrote about it also extensively, but I didn't, it's only when I translated this book that I understood how heavily she relied on poetry as a coping mechanism, and how she had done that all her life, that if she hadn't had poetry in her life, she felt that she would have disintegrated. It's so the profundity of her reliance on poetry is something that I really could appreciate fully for the first time while I was translating the poetry. And in a way, it also became a coping mechanism for me too, because I was translating the poetry just after my mother had died, during a pandemic raging in the world, locked into a room in a Manhattan apartment. And as difficult, as painful as it was to translate my mother's poetry while I was grieving, because with every poem I could hear her voice, I could see her face. It was very difficult, but I think if I hadn't had it, it would have been that much more difficult. So I think the poetry, just in the way that it had helped her cope, it taught me how poetry can help cope with grief in my case as well. And my grandmother, who was a very celebrated poet herself, she was Radharani Devi. She was married at 12 and she was widowed at 13. She was a child widow who educated herself, remarried, became a best-selling writer. She was she was an early feminist. She was a force of nature. She was someone who used poetry as an instrument to freedom, very much so. And I wanted to read a poem that my mother and my mother had written about my grandmother. They had an extremely close relationship. As I was telling you earlier, we grew up in this all-female family with my grandmother Radharani, my mother Nabaneeta, my older sister Antara, who is also a writer and a journalist and an editor, and me. So we grew up with books and poetry and arguments and huge emotions around us at all times. And my mother and my grandmother were extremely close. My mother, they loved each other's work. They were each other's most tireless editors and most admiring critics, and they shared everything with each other. But it was a very close but complicated relationship. And even though we grew up together, we lived in a house together for most of my early life until I left for college. It wasn't until I translated this poem and I translated the poetry that my mother had written about my grandmother, poetry that I had known for years, but it was only while I was translating it that I actually understood more about what was fraught in their relationship, why their relationship was as complicated as it was in some ways, although it was also extremely loving and extremely intimate. So this is a poem called The Lamp. My mother wrote it on my grandmother's birthday a few years after she died. The Lamp, memories on my mother's birthday. Go to sleep now, Ma, it's way past 11. 11? It's still early then, but you must go to bed. You have college tomorrow. Ma sits in her easy chair, thick glasses perched on her thin nose, pale fingers clutching her magnifying glass. The statesman spread out across her lap. Next to her, on the table, her flask of tea, her medicines, her fragrant beetle leaf in its silver case, her brass spittoon, her cash box. Behind her, on the teapoy, an earthen vase filled with her favorite white tuberoses, and a wicker table lamp weaved in agartala. Before her, the alarm clock ticking away, her traveling timepiece. As Ma turns the pages of the newspaper, its noisy crackle splinters the quiet night. Closing my book, I come to her. As soon as I step inside, I drown in the deep perfume of those tuberoses. The nurse is dozing in her chair. Ma, please go to sleep now. It's 1:30. 1:30? She scolds. And you're still awake? Aren't you teaching tomorrow? Swallowing the rebuke, I keep on wheedling. You'll get sick, Ma, if you stay up like this. You must take care of your body. My body? Ma breaks into laughter that sparkles like jewelry shimmering from head to toe. How much more sick can it get? And what use is my body, anyway? I go to her one more time before I sleep. It's 2:30, Ma. Do call it a night. Come, let me take you to your bed. Yes, I'm coming, just coming. There's only this one tiny bit left. Reading isn't so easy now, you see. It's the gift of these cataracts. With a slight smile, embarrassed, apologetic, she buries herself in printed words. Under the glowing light of the table lamp, with her focus on the magnifying glass, the ticking of the alarm clock fades away. As I walk back to my room, I hear her speaking softly to the nurse. No, no, my dear. Don't turn off the light. Keep that lamp switched on, please. I have just one more page left. Just one more page left. One more paragraph. One more sentence. Give me one more word, dear nurse. Just one more day. This is a favorite poem of my sisters and my mother and mine, and also of course my mother's, but my Didi and I were both very close to my grandmother as well. But I think in this last year, as I was translating it, it has somehow become a poem about my mother and me, no longer about my grandmother and my mother. I want to read a poem that one of your biggest favorites, poem on my birthday, which you referred to in your introduction as well. This is a poem that my mother wrote on her birthday, on her own birthday, as opposed to the other one, which she wrote a few years after my grandmother died on my grandmother's birthday. Poem on my birthday. In one eye hangs half a teardrop, in the other, nothing. Is the girl sleeping? Or is she awake but lost in dreams? In thought? The girl is asleep. Left arm flung across her forehead, right hand on her lips. If this silent household awakens, the girl will not wake up. In her one eye sways a teardrop, in the other, nothing. All day, all night, her ears ring with wild applause like a waterfall in the monsoon. The girl remains asleep, a tear in one eye, in the other, nothing. Long ago, the girl had seen a trapeze act in a circus. Two acrobats were flying like birds from perch to perch. All around them a great emptiness, and in the center, long swings, swaying in celebration. Awake or asleep, night or day, the girl is lost in a dream of trapeze. In one eye swings a teardrop, in the other, nothing. My mother felt very strongly that she had two eyes that were unalike, is the word that she used, unalike. And she meant that literally. She meant that one eye actually looked and felt different from the other, that one eye could never shed a tear and one eye could never smile. So there was this, and she wrote about it quite a lot. She said that this was the sad eye was the one that looked inward, and she used the sad eye to write her poetry, whereas the eye that didn't know how to weep was the one that she brought into her prose. Her prose and her poetry, I mean, what was remarkable about her body of work was that no matter what she wrote, she brought absolute honesty into it. So she did not hide herself in any way in her poetry. Her poetry was very visceral. It was full of inner turmoil. It was often very disturbing. And in her prose, which was autobiographical, and she wrote about her life, she laughed at herself mercilessly. She was very self-deprecating. Her humor was true to what was happening in her world, but she was able to show the absurdity of life with a kind of irreverence and joy that was so rambunctious and so infectious. So, in fact, the huge following that she has around the world, a lot of it has to do with this, with the prose, with the narrative nonfiction that she wrote, the columns that she wrote. And these two sides to her were just as true. They were equally true to who she was. She was not afraid to cry in her poetry, and she absolutely loved making fun of herself in her prose. That's just the way she was. So I want to read a poem that, to me, represents these two sides of herself, of her writerly self.
Nandana, I'm sorry to interrupt. Tobias in the chat is just responding to the first poem, which was read in Bengali.
Right.
Maybe this poem, if you could read it in Bengali first, if that's available, and then read the English.
Sure. This one, the one that I'm reading now?
Yeah, that would be lovely.
I can do that easily.
Thanks, Tobias. And if anybody listening wants to drop a line or a word or a fragment into the chat, that would be so beautiful. Anything that reaches you, like a vibration, just feel free to write in the chat as well.
Yes, that would be really lovely. Thank you for that suggestion. So, নির্বাচন, তুমি মনস্থির করো কাকে চাও, তাকে না আমাকে? আমার মাঝখানে আছে দুজন মানুষ, তুমি মন স্থির করো কাকে চাও, তাকে না আমাকে? Make up your mind. Who do you want? That woman or me? Within me breathe two people. Make up your mind. Who do you want? That woman or me? I want to come back to what we were talking about earlier, what you write about so beautifully in all your poetry, Bhanu, which is the connection between freedom, survival, and poetry. My mother often said that she felt blessed and cursed by poetry. She was born into a poet family. Both her parents were poets, grew up in a house that was filled with poetry. So she felt that she had no choice but to be a poet. And although she wrote in every genre, she started writing poetry when she was 7. You know, her first book of poems came out when she was 21. She kept writing poetry till the last few weeks of her life, and she saw herself primarily as a poet. But she felt that poetry had to be, with poetry came a great responsibility. She felt that poetry had to be earned. And she was as aware, as much as she celebrated the liberating power of poetry, as much as she wrote about how poetry was central to a woman's freedom, she was also deeply aware of the destructive potential of language. And she wrote about that as well, and she brought that into her poetry too. So I want to actually now show you a clip of my mother reading a poem which is a warning about the power and the cruelty that can lurk behind language. If we could have that video.
বড় হওয়ার পাঁচ রক্তপাতে ভয় পাস ছেলে, কৌমার জ্বরে ভয় পাস, একবার রক্তের স্বাদ পেলে বুঝি সর্বনাশ, শ্বাসবার না চাস, তোকে রক্ত নিত্য ঋষিরাকে ডাকে। ছেলে তুমি বড় হয়ে ওঠো, জানো না তো অক্ষরও কত হিংস্র হতে পারে, জিহ্বা কত চতুরালি জানে, স্বপ্ন পারা পারে কি রক্ত ঝরাতে পারে ঠোঁট।
I will read the English translation of that now. It's called Growing Up Lesson. Boy, are you scared of bloodshed? Are you terrified of plucking virginity? If the taste of blood goes to your head, do you fear that it will be a calamity? The truth is, whether wrong or right, your blood calls out to you each night. Listen, boy, it's time for you to grow. Words can be as fierce, don't you know? The treachery that lingers on tongue tips, beyond the worlds that all your dreams show. Know that blood can be easily shed by lips. Bhanu, I would really love hear some of your poetry now. Can I ask you to read from How to Wash Up? Well, actually, I love all your books, but perhaps you could read from How to Wash Up.
Yes, of course. But first, I have to have a sip of this tea. And also just, we had some conversations before we met. We had a beautiful cup of tea in Cambridge on a freezing cold day. You kindly sat outside with me. So I'm remembering our conversations, and I'm just paying attention to everything I only understand now, when everything's, together. And really listening to the poem, the poetry in another way. So I'm just really paying attention to this intense contrast between depictions of visceral life, almost dismemberment, and then like a delicate flower at the same time. Because the question is like, why poetry? What does poetry make possible that other genres, might not? And I'm so moved by this feeling that I've learnt from you, this idea that poetry is the way that you can write yourself out of one life and into another, quite literally. So I just want to stay close to that and say, this book that I wrote, that I'll just read one or two poems from. I was sitting on a sofa in the United States wondering how to return to England. How could I get there. And I wrote this book with the vision of returning to my birthplace, which I feel this book made possible. But also, Nandana, seeing the Poets House video. Poets House, Stephen Motica is my Nightboat publisher, who published the other two books up there. So I feel this beautiful connection with New York, with experimental writing and gestures just through seeing that video, and the shaking of it actually seemed so important. And I'm thinking, like, say that again.
Pointing that, I was just saying thank you for identifying it. Actually, I should let the audience know that was my mother's very last trip to New York. And it was the last poetry reading that she did here, which was at the Poets House in New York, and it was really very, very beautiful. It's a lovely venue, but that's the last footage we have of her.
Wow.
Yeah,
it's very powerful. And as I watched it today, I met a poet, Petra Cooper's, in the Bay Area some years ago, and Petra Cooper said, this is just in a Cafe Gratitude, it was called, in Berkeley. She said, I'm not interested in disclosure, I am interested in discharge. And something about the shaking, like this idea, like the poem is not just a portrait or an auto-portrait. And I love the way that your mom like distinguished between extra literary, or like, this kind of, even the kind of salaciousness about like, how does someone live, who they are, and just wanting to create work that, happen differently. And so what the poem moves through as much as what it says, and that's a nervous system event,
Yes.
How we cope, perhaps, how we shake, how we
tremble. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm looking at the time, and I had chosen 3 poems, but I'm just going to read one poem, Nandana, because I want to, if that's okay, I want to make space for anyone who might have a question about translation, about adaptation, intimacy, and proximity to what the book is. So perhaps as I read my poem, I invite anyone who's listening to drop a question into the chat. That would be very beautiful. And, if not, perhaps just a response. Let us remember that we're in a waterfall, we're in a fountain. This is a book launch that's grounded in love. So if you'd like to send and write something of that nature, if you'd like to toss a coin into the fountain, so to speak. On that note, yes, you can get the book from Archipelago Books, but you might try Waterstones or bookshops.org here in the UK, and I think it's at the bottom scrolling, but you can try Shakespeare and Company in Europe. So I'm just going to read one poem, and it is this. How do you live when the link between creativity and survival can't easily be discerned? Nabaneeta, how do you live when the link between creativity and survival can't easily be discerned? I came here to ask you this question. The answer to this question brought me here. My fingertips bloom on the cream-colored card. Can you delete it? And with a click, a sideways glance, the name a lover murmured at 3 a.m. is groomed. I remember when I was a treasured pet, with casual greed, how I licked that salty cream. Out of context, a question. For someone I wish very much that I had the chance to meet. Thank you for inviting me to match the vibration of your mother's poems and your translations, your adaptations Nandana, and I just want to just pull out a question from the chat, if I may.
Yes.
Arun writes, question, while translating, Nandana, did you feel any bias might be there? What precaution did you take to move away from bias?
Well,
Huh.
I guess it depends on what you mean by bias. I understand the question. Did you feel if the question is, would I have translated it differently if I had not been her daughter? I'm not sure that I would have, actually. I don't know that I would have been able to take some of the liberties that I took if I didn't feel somehow emboldened by the familiarity that I had with her. So if that's the bias that you're talking about, I think I think I couldn't have. I don't think I could have translated it in this way had I not had kind of privileged intimacy with her. If you're talking about other kinds of biases like political biases or I think if what is really important in translation is sort of not to be affected by your bias, right? So if the poetry has a bias, then it's your job to translate that bias. You do that. You're true to that bias, even if you don't agree with that, even if that's not your point of view may not be that, right? So that's the way that I approached it. Thank you for that question. What's the next question?
Yeah, I think there was another variation. But then there is another question from Upasya. Could you please read the translations of, and it's come up under the screen. My Bengali is not beautiful or in existence, so if you could read that aloud.
I see
Yeah.
it. Joban and Dharshan Ratri Striti, those are both two of my favorite poems, Upasya. You want me to read the translations of them, right? Okay. I'm on it.
Lovely.
So I'm going to start with Dharshan Ratir Sriti, which I translated as Take Back the Night. Man, in the twilight, I could still hear the lark. Woman, the night was moonless, oppressively dark. Man, in the flowering woods, a night fairy walked. Woman, in the Sundarbans, the man-eater stalked. Man, in that fragrant springtime air, woman, blood-drenched remains lay there. Catch of the day, Jiol. I want to chop it up, slice it into pieces, grind it into a paste, season it, then shut it in the oven. They didn't win, the sun, the rain, the earth. It's still all raw inside, floundering like a catfish, still alive, freshly caught. My youth.
Thank you so much. It's so beautiful to hear it in your voice, your background, who you are, Nandana. Like, again, dismemberment, and then something light and something that goes right through the heart, that strikes a blow. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we have another question from Mamata. When you translate a poem, do you worry about the possibility of your interpretation of the poem being different from some others? Yeah, I think this is a question that speaks to adaptation, to this gap between, and can we think of that gap as sacred, I want to say? What is there?
Yeah. I think it's a beautiful thing that different translators translate the same work differently, because it just goes to our understand. And we are, especially in India, it's taking us a long time to understand that translation is a creative process. It's not a technical process. It's not a formula that you're writing in another formula. It is really literary work. It's creative work. You are recreating the translated text, right? So to me, it's not surprising that there could be different interpretations of the same poem. And that is something I've been thinking about it a lot lately, actually, because I've been considering, it has suggested to me that perhaps I should think about translating some of Tagore's songs as songs, because they've been translated as poetry. And I mean, I've done a couple of them, and I could already see how very different they are from the way those same songs or poems have been translated by Tagore, have been translated by others. So it is, I don't worry about it. I think if anything, actually, I celebrate it. I think that is what, there is something of yourself that you bring into that work as a translator, and you transform it in your own way. And the rightness or wrongness of things is almost immaterial in this case. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important, that it's imaginative. It's an imaginative practice and pathway in its own right. Thank you.
Exactly.
And lots of gestures and notes of appreciation and care and love, and the memory of your mom as well, Nandana. And then perhaps our last question from Nyanika. I hope I pronounced your name right. I'm a bit of a feral Punjabi via Northwest London over here. But we have Nabaneeta D's poetry, and its translation by Nandana is so achingly beautiful in itself, but listening to Nandana give it context and reveal the thoughts behind it makes it even more so. To know that Acrobat, one of my favorites, was written referring to a poet creating poetry makes the last line, "Only once in your life will the rope shiver," seem almost like this beautiful sacred act, which to my mind true creation is. And it certainly holds true here. Heart emoji deluxe. Thank you for this wonderful sesh. Yeah.
Thank you, Noyan. Thank you, Noyan. That's a beautiful, beautiful comment. Somebody just sent a message here saying, "Are you not going to?" Somebody sent a message here. "Are you going to read your letter?" But I'm just not sure if you.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes. I think because this is a video that will outlast this beautiful late September hour. Please, I think that would be a wonderful way to close this event, and maybe we can just stay close to our own hearts as we listen, and just beam love to Nandana, to her mom. I think that would be a perfect way to close.
Great. And if there are questions after that, I'm happy to stay on and answer more questions. This has been a really lovely session, because you've made it very special and very emotional, Bhanu. You really have. Okay. So this is a letter I wrote. I keep coming back to that book that was on the sly, written on the sly, because this is a poem I started writing to my mother on her 75th birthday. And I kept writing, adding to it as the years went on. I finished it after she died, but she had read most of it when she was alive, and she told me that if she weren't able to write the introduction to the book, to Acrobat, that she was very excited about, then I should use this letter as a way of introducing her to the readers. So that's why this letter is actually included in the book. A letter to Ma. It is true I was created in you. It is also true that you were created for me. Maya Angelou. My first semester in college. You arrived in between your conferences, suitcases and admirers in tow. Refusing abundant offers of hospitality in Cambridge, you shared and immediately redecorated the 1.5 rooms assigned to my 2 roommates and me. Every morning, you stood in line in our noisy dormitory to claim your 3 minutes in the shower. You preferred the modern steel and glass shower stalls opposite our room to the quieter, more old-fashioned bathroom down the hall. You left after a week, just as I was getting used to finding your hip-length hair in my comb and turning every head in the 1,000-strong Harvard Union when you swept into dinner with me, gliding in like a queen, like you always did. A few weeks later, we hit midterm exams. I overslept the first day, found the showers occupied, and sprinted to the other bathroom in panic. As I stumbled onto freezing tiles and fiddled with the cranky knob that spurted cold water for red and boiling for blue, something miraculously familiar caught my eye. A crimson dot of velvet on the narrow grey wall. Your well-traveled bindi, carefully transported from your forehead and placed beyond reach of the spray. In a flash, I could hear your laugh and smell your scent. I could feel the tension in my neck melt into the mist surrounding me. That perfect circle of red gave evidence on the mildewed wall that you would always be there, far away, so close. Although there were unending demands on your time, a few years ago, you had somehow managed to find several days for us to translate together my bedtime book for children, Not Yet. The book is a playful dialogue in rhyme between a mother and a child. A naughty little girl finds countless excuses not to go to bed, while her ever-patient mother is determined to put her to sleep. The literal Bengali translation of Not Yet is Akhonina, but you had laughed your own little girl laugh and declared, No, the girl must be much more emphatic. She will say, Ekkunina, Ekkunina. Well, this obstinate daughter of yours kept saying to her mother in the last few weeks, Ekkunina, Ekkunina. Could you hear me, Ma? Not too long ago, I pulled a big blue book from our Kolkata shelf, 365 bedtime stories. When I opened it, out fell a red gold rush of leaves, oaks, maples, and ferns collected in London when I was a toddler. We had gathered them together in the woods at the bottom of the hill where we lived. One night, as you were reading to me about Tinker Bell, I interrupted you with a technical question. What are fairy wings made of? Butterfly wings, bird feathers, or huge petals? There are all kinds of fairies, you see, you replied, just as there are all kinds of people. Do all fairies look like you? I persisted. I don't think so, you smiled. Fairies are very, very beautiful. But Ma, I protested, you're the most beautiful person in the world. You laughed, much more raucously than Tinker Bell would, as you drew heavy curtains over tall windows. Every little girl believes that about their mother, Tumpush. Well, Ma, I've grown up a bit. My world has grown up a lot. I left home as a child and made beautiful friends who became my family. In my work, I've met many beautiful faces, walked with beautiful figures. I've fallen in love with beautiful minds. You grew up too. More books published, many awards won. A few more clashes with your stubbornly loving daughters. Around your eyes, a few more lines celebrating years of full-throated life. More world tours, many with me, when you swept me away with your infectious appetite for discovery, your limitless sense of wonder. Remember that list we made some years ago of unvisited countries we absolutely had to explore? Wheelchair in tow, we made it to most entries on that list, including China, Egypt, South Africa, but not Burma. Each time we traveled, you transformed our adventures into provocative essays or best-selling books, and on every trip, we shared even more pleasures together, than our plentiful arguments. Yes, we did have fights. I cried when you didn't understand. I begged you not to nag. I yelled at you when I was upset with someone else. I watched in panic as tears welled up in your ever-adolescent eyes. But I am as sure today as I was that night in London that even if you had not been my mother, even if that most precious accident of birth had by rights been the beginning of someone else's story, even if I'd met you in any of your other roles as a poet, professor, painter, friend, or a stranger on a plane, you would still be the most beautiful person I could ever have met. At the end of Not Yet, the daughter asks, Ma, did you turn out the light? And the mother replies, Yes, my dear. Now, good night.
Thank you, beautiful friend. Thank you, everyone who's been here holding the space, holding the boundary. We can't see you, but we can feel you.
There you are.
Thank you, Nandana.
You disappeared for a while, but now.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was such a beautiful celebration of her work, of her spirit, of her love. And I love that it's also a celebration of how poetry is passed on between generations of women, like it was passed on from her to you, from you to me. And it's I can't think of a lovelier way to bring this book out into the world. I don't know if there were other questions that I missed when I was reading. Were there?
I don't see any more. I just see many, many notes of appreciation and love. That crimson dot of velvet keeps on shining bright, right, Upasya or Upasyu, adding color to our lives. She will always be remembered through her brilliant writing in laughter and joy, your mum. And there it is.
Thank you. Beautiful.
There it is. Good night.
Well, thank you so much to everybody again. Thank you for joining us from all over the world. Happy Translation Day again to all 6 time zones that are represented here. A big thank you to Archipelago Books for making this beautiful book. Huge thank you to Nehru Center for organizing this, to Vineet, to Archana, and of course to Amish for presenting our event together with so much love. And more than anything else, all my love and my thanks to my beloved poet, friend, muse. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much it means to me that you're here celebrating my mother's poetry with all of us today. Thank you, Bhanu.
My pleasure. I'm just remembering a childhood habit, Nandana, which is bibliomancy. Could we end on bibliomancy?
Yes. Remind me what. Okay.
It is the ancient Egyptian art of opening a book at random to receive a message, a sentence as conduit. Let's see.
Okay.
Look, how light are the hands and feet now. The ribs have melted into fluffy softness.
That's wonderful. Should I do the same?
Yes.
Is that the way it works?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to do it with your book.
Oh.
The history, a brilliant child. Okay, maybe let's see. Is a poet an imperial dissident, or just an outline of pale blue chalk?
And I should mention that the line that I read from was from the poem Metamorphosis.
Yes.
May I read the whole poem?
Yeah, I love that poem.
Okay, maybe this will be the grand finale. Could you read it in Bengali and then I'll read it in English?
I have to find that. That's not so easy to find.
Okay.
So,
okay.
But
A compromise. You read the whole poem just as it is.
How about this? You read that in English, and then I will read Imperial Dissident.
That is very exciting. This is the official grand finale of the event. Metamorphosis. One morning, just like Gregor Samsa, your whole world too changed forever. Did you ever think this could happen, would happen? Did you ever imagine that so easily lifelong ties of birth could unravel with no resistance? Look, how light are the hands and feet now. The ribs have melted into fluffy softness. The muscles can be torn like fine paper. Now even the sharp stab of a dagger would not draw a single drop of blood. In the afternoon, the maid will sweep the dead insect into the rubbish bin.
Beautifully read. Beautifully read. This was called, just because you read it, it was in Bengali, it's called One Morning Just Like Gregor Samsa. But I decided to put Metamorphosis in the title because I wasn't sure if I didn't want to have, what I didn't want to do in this book is to ever have footnotes. I didn't want to explain anything in it. I wanted all the information made, so that's why I decided to change the title and make it Metamorphosis. Okay. Is a poet an imperial dissident, or just an outline of pale blue chalk? What happens to the memory of other languages, carried in the body as poetry, when everyone on the periphery, the people who memorize these poems on their long journeys to other lands, is gone? My ancestral line was decimated, for example, one hot night.
And that's how poets have fun.
That's how poets have fun, and would gladly continue having fun for a very long time. But it's really so lovely to be here with you, Bhanu, and to be here with everybody. I don't feel like saying goodbye, but I think everybody needs to get on with things. If there's anything else, one last, oh God, I've lost everything. Oh, here. One last comment, or
Here's one. It's from Subha Lakshmi. And I'd love for this to be the last image that this event might emanate. Would you like to read those lines about your mum?
Yes. Miss those ever-adolescent eyes and her smile that lit up the room as soon as she entered a space. And now it lights up the skies. It's beautiful. Thank you, Mama. Thank you. That's a lovely image to end with.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.